across, sunk into the trenches, so you had two options if you were fighting against the Germans. You could either stay in the trenches and die of poison chlorine gas, or you could jump out of the trenches and get machine gunned by the Germans. So this is a picture of troops back then, and you can see a lot of them actually that were farther away survived the attack actually, but chlorine, if you get it in your eyes, blinds you, so they're all blinded actually. So you see them here, hand on shoulder, trying to move across after the battlefield to first aid stations. So that's where sort of the horror of chemical weapons really became very visible to everybody, and it was out of that the Geneva Convention in 1925 was created that prohibited the use of chemical agents in warfare, but did not prohibit the research, development, testing, and production and stockpiling of chemical agents. There have been plenty of chemical weapons threats in the last few decades. And the biggest use probably was in the Iran-Iraq War. Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, this was an 8-year war, 1980 to 1988 more or less. Saddam Hussein fired chemical agents across the border into Iran again and again and again. And he killed, I don't know how many tens of thousands of Iranians. And today there's actually a very active anti-chemical warfare advocacy group in Iran that we work with actually very closely, and they come to The Hague. I'll see them in December when we're all together in The Hague. And they bring in the victims who survived from these chemical attacks, and they were attacked probably as children, and they're now 30 or 40 years old, still suffering from the long-term impact of some of these agents. The other big use, which was really horrific, was in Halabja, which is, as you know, in northern Iraq, in Kurdistan. And Saddam Hussein, out of the blue, one day started dropping aerial bombs and spray tanks all over the village of Halabja and killed about 5,000 people in Halabja. So today, the mayor of Halabja actually also comes, I just mentioned to Greg earlier, also comes to the OPCW and speaks about the horrors of chemical warfare. In 91 Gulf War, agents were not used, but in fact were released during and after the Gulf War. Saddam Hussein had chemical weapon stockpiles back then, and when we attacked Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis and pushed him out of Kuwait, we went after most of his weapons depots, and we subsequently learned that a lot of the depots, which we thought had conventional weapons in them, actually had chemical weapons in them. And so you'll find today a lot of the Iraq War #1, the Gulf War in 91, veterans, U.S. and Allied veterans, have probably long-term health impacts from accidental releases of chemical agents from the Gulf War. Right after the Gulf War, actually, United Nations inspectors went in, destroyed all the known chemical weapons and agents of Saddam Hussein, and threw everything into a couple of very large sort of soccer football field size bunkers that we're still dealing with today, and I'll talk about that later. 95 Tokyo subway attack, Aum Shinrikyo, the Japanese terrorist group, had tested both biological and chemical weapons a couple times before 95, but in 95 in the subway attack, they basically brought in 4 plastic baggies of sandwich bags filled with homemade sarin gas, sarin agent, sarin liquid. It's usually liquid, by the way, not gaseous. And they could have killed thousands of people. They wound up killing about a dozen people and injuring 5,000 in the Tokyo subways, largely because it wasn't vaporized, it wasn't deployed properly. They basically just punctured the bags, dropped them on the floor of the subway cars, let people step over it. People thought it was a puddle of something. Before long, anyone who stepped in it or got splashed with it at all started suffering the effects. And total panic happened in the subway system, and I think probably 3/4 of the 5,000 injured were simply from the panic attack, having nothing to do with chemical agents at all. Ongoing terrorist threats, Osama bin Laden and others have constantly said that they want to get their hold on nuclear, chemical, biological, or radiological materials to do more massive damage in terrorist attacks. And then, of course, Syria, that we've just talked about. So let me mention who has chemical weapons today, or who had chemical weapons today. There's 190 state parties now with Syria countries who've joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, but there's only 8 who've declared active chemical weapons stockpiles. The biggest is Russia, Russia's declared 40,000 metric tons. The United States declared 28,600 metric tons. This was just as the treaty was signed and entered into force. It was signed in 1993, entered into force in 1997. India, somewhere around 1,000 metric tons. They don't declare this publicly, so it's really guesstimates on our part. But it's in the range of 1,000. South Korea, about 1,000 metric tons. South Korea still keeps it fully confidential. Doesn't allow their name to even be used. If I were a diplomat here, which I'm not, but if I were a diplomat, I'd have to put a state party there, not South Korea. So we still have some issues with South Korea that they, to this day, they've officially, in internal documents declared their stockpile and destroyed it, actually. But in fact, they don't allow their name to be used by any country officially as a possessor state. Libya declared about 26 tons, give or take a few kilograms. Albania, 16 metric tons, and I'll come back to that. Iraq has these two enormous bunkers we can talk about more later. We don't know what's inside, left over from the United Nations inspectors in the 1990s. And now Syria with somewhere in the range of 1,000 metric tons. So it's interesting that Syria's stockpile is about the same as India. Probably India and South Korea, but I think a very different type of stockpile. So you'll hear the total used. I have the number here, 72,500. Sometimes you'll hear a smaller number. If you go on the OPCW website, you'll hear 68 or 69,000 tons. But you have to understand what they're counting. And because the treaty entered into force in 1997, so everything that was existing in 97 was declared here, at least for Russia and the United States, which were the original, and India and South Korea. But the United States started operating its first destruction facility in 1990. So the United States had actually destroyed a couple thousand tons prior to the treaty entering into force. So the numbers can be quite different. And this is just a rough estimate. It's probably a few hundred tons one way or the other. So where were our stockpiles and are our stockpiles in the United States? This was completely top secret until the mid-1990s. And I still remember actually after 9/11 in 2002, I think it was, early 2002, making a presentation somewhere, and a Department of Defense official came up to me, and I had this map, this very map, and he said, "That's top secret, you can't use that." I said, "It's been declassified for like 15 years, something like that." He said, "No, this is after 9/11, you can't talk about this at all." Well, we can talk about it. So this is where the stockpiles were. We had 9 big stockpiles. The one closest to here was in Aberdeen, Maryland, right off the highway, right on the edge of the Chesapeake Bay. You'll see up there in the far right-hand side, it says Aberdeen Chemical Agent Disposal Facility. That was something like 1,200 tons, I think. The smallest one is the second one on the right, Bluegrass Army Depot, and that's the one that's only 475 metric tons, more or less. And that's still not destroyed, that's still there. And that'll be probably the most expensive one to destroy because it's the most complicated one. And the biggest one is over to the left, the second one down from the left, called Tooele Chemical Agent Disposal Facility. And that had somewhere over 14,000 metric tons, the biggest stockpile in the world, far and away, just west of Salt Lake City. Yeah?
You keep saying metric tons. I'm just curious, what does that mean? What can a metric ton do?
Metric ton is 1,000 kilograms.
Right.
So it's a little bit larger than a U.S. ton.
Okay, but like what can this amount of chemical weapons like do?
A lot of it's always measured in tons, these enormous stockpiles. But a typical weapon probably has 3, 4, 5 kilograms of agent in it. So a ton could have, a few hundred weapons that could be made out of it. So for each ton, you're talking a few hundred. I mean, the destruction programs to date have destroyed somewhere over 10 million chemical weapons. So we've had just enormous amounts. All of us ask the question, who ever dreamed of building all this? For what purpose, But it's really hard to measure. But any single weapon, depending on where it's used, how it's deployed, could probably kill a few thousand people. I mean, if you think back to the 2002 Moscow theater terrorist event, an incident called the Nordos Theater in Moscow, where Chechen terrorists came in and took, well, how many, 400 or 500, I think, Russian citizens hostage. And the Russians couldn't figure out how to, how to resolve this. The terrorists had explosive vests taped around them and detonator buttons and all the rest. And finally, they introduced what was thought to be a non-lethal agent, a veterinary anesthesia called fentanyl. And this was a fentanyl derivative that the Russians apparently had been researching, perhaps in violation of the treaty. But they introduced that in a vapor fashion into the air conditioning system to try to save the hostages and put the terrorists to sleep so they could get to them and decouple the explosives and everything from them. They wound up killing almost everybody in the theater because they waited too long. They didn't have adequate medical care when they came out, so they put everyone to sleep, but they put them to sleep permanently, so to speak. And we realized then that was a small amount of non-lethal agent that was introduced in the theater and killed, I don't know how many hundreds it was, 300 or 400 people. And so, any one of these weapons, if it were actually adequately released in a vapor fashion, in a football stadium, in a basketball forum,